Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 31st of January of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And during the previous 24 hours, the most important updates were coming from the Andreevka fortified area direction. As you can see, we have lots of icons in this area. The Russians most likely have begun their final assault operation, and most likely in a day or in a two or in a week, the entire direction will collapse and the Russians will take under control every single settlement, including the settlement of Dashna, Ulakli, Constantinople and Andreevka. And if this area falls, I'm not even sure where exactly the Ukrainians are going to stop the Russians, because this is the last more or less reliable defense belt of the armored force of Ukraine on the way to the settlements of Zaporozhye, Dnipro and Gulai Pole. Now let's discuss in details what was happening during the day. And first we're going to talk about the Constantinople direction. According to information we have, the Russians launched an offensive operation in this area with the purpose to take under control the farms, these farms that are located in the southeastern part of the settlement. This information we got from several pro-Russian resources, very reliable resources, as for now without any changes on the ground. As you can see, there are lots of trenches and the fortifications that Ukrainians created around the southern part of the settlement, so obviously it will take time when the Russians can take these territories under complete control. But if the Russians, as a result of this southern offensive operation, are able to take under control the southern part of the settlement of Constantinople, then this is going to be a very huge problem for the armored force of Ukraine. A little bit further to the north, we can see another geolocation that was published by the Russian side. In this video, we can see how that Ukrainians most likely managed to restore or to rebuild another pontoon bridge in this area with the purpose to maybe to have some chances and to have some mechanism to evacuate soldiers and assets from Ulakli and Dashna. But the Russians, as soon as the Ukrainians restored the bridge, the Russians destroyed this bridge once again. Probably this is the second or the third video from the same area. Now let's move a little bit further in the eastern direction. We got lots of very interesting details and updates from this territory. The Russian forces managed to improve their positions between the settlements of Ulakli and Dashny. The Russians are attacking using the broad front line attack from the river of Sukhye Yale in the northern direction, the northwestern and the northeastern direction. Here we can see the movements of Russian vehicles, Russian motorcycles, and we see that Ukrainians can't do anything with this. When the Russians landed in this area, the Ukrainians sent several drones and they began FPV attacking them. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map and we have colored everything to the north of Sukhye Yale and Yantarny in Russian favor. So if we compare the map, for example, this is the situation by the end of the 30th of January of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 31st of January of 2025. So from this video we can make a conclusion that the Russians are trying to attack in the direction of Ulakli. The Russians are trying to improve their positions and to get as close as possible to the N15 road, and the Russians are trying to improve their positions and to attack the Ukrainians from behind in the area of Dashna. When talking about area of Dashna, the Ukrainians are trying to stick as close as possible to the northwestern part, because they understand that sooner or later either they will receive an order to retreat or they will make their own decision to fall back from these territories, because they understand that the longer they stay here, the less chances they have to survive. Obviously, the Ukrainians understand that there are no chances to get evacuation vehicles, because, for example, during the day, most likely the Ukrainians made several attempts to evacuate the Ukrainian soldiers from the territory of Dashna, but everything that was moving in the direction of Dashna was discovered by the Russians and destroyed. So this is another episode of destroyed vehicles somewhere along N15 road. So now it's already a cold room and the Ukrainians are suffering huge losses. And now let's discuss the final part. The final direction is the northern direction, where the Russians continue their offensive in the direction of Andreevka. During the day we got lots of updates from different sources that the Russians managed to enter the settlement of Andreevka from the east, and according to different mappers, this complex network of the fortifications was also captured by the Russians. And later, right before we start making the video, we got a very huge video of 2 minutes published by the 114th Force Motor Rifle Brigade of the Armored Forces of Russian Federation. And in this video we can see lots of episodes that's been taking place for the previous 2 or 3 days of how the Russians were attacking this region, how the Russians were storming the company stronghold in the eastern part of the settlement, so how the Russians were after withdrawing the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the settlement itself, how the Russians were destroying Ukrainian strongholds and trenches, and how the Russians were clearing them. In the final episode of the video we can see artillery strikes, so FAB strikes in the most northwestern part of the settlement, the area that Ukrainians still can use to bring forces in the direction of Andreevka fortified area. So this is very important battle, and currently the Russians, as I understand, attack the Ukrainians in this side of this red line. And once again, if the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control, this part of Andreevka, then the distance between the possible positions in the southern part of this area and in the northern part would be less than 3 kilometers, and this is already obviously a cauldron. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of Nadenka. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly. Just yesterday, pro-Ukrainian sources published a video of how the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians in the area of the settlement of Novoandreevka, and based on this video, yesterday on the 30th of January, we have adjusted the map in this part of front line. This is the video. Let's take a look at this video once again. We can see how the Ukrainians entered this tree line with the purpose to restore control over the lost positions. And today, by the end of the 31st of January, we see that the Russians have already established control over 50% of the settlement of Nadenka. There are very heavy clashes in this area as well, and most likely tomorrow the Russians will continue their offensive operation. And if Nadenka, the village of Nadenka, falls, then most likely the Russians will begin offensive operation in the northern direction with the purpose to attack Novoalexandriivka and Uspienovka from behind, because basically these are two villages left on the Russian side of the river of Salona, and this is very important for the Russians to take them under control. And from the same village of Nadenka, the Russians most likely will continue advancing further, but in the southwestern direction with the purpose to attack the settlements like Preobrazhenka, this is the settlement from the north, to attack the settlement of Troitska from the north, and to attack the settlements like Zaporozhye and Sribne as well. So we see that Ukrainians, despite forces they have, despite military aid they receive from the Western countries, can't stabilize the front line, can't slow down the Russians, and every single day we're getting closer and closer to a complete disaster. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pakros direction. As for this territory, we see that there is a real operational pause. We haven't received anything from this area for the previous 3 days. After the Russians established complete control over the settlement of Kotlina, over these facilities, after the Russians managed to take under control the eastern part of Dashna, the Russians stopped. It's very difficult to understand why the Russians are not moving further. Maybe the Russians managed to achieve everything they needed. They were needed, for example, the Russians cut the railways between the city of Pakrovsk and the mainland, and maybe this was the primary target of the Russians during this offensive operation. Maybe the main purpose of this attack was to secure the flank, the northeastern flank, and now the Russians can continue advancing further in the direction of Dnipro region. Very difficult to understand. Or maybe the Russians did everything they needed to begin offensive operation in the direction of Pakrovsk. Anyway, the Russians stopped. They are regrouping right now, and most likely during the next 10 days we are not going to see anything from this area, and maybe then the Russians will continue. Now let's discuss the situation in the eastern flank of the city of Pakrovsk. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian sources published a video of how the Russians were attacking some territories in this area. We can't say for sure where exactly the Russians were moving, because the Ukrainians published the video which is limited when talking about the region where the Russians were moving, so we don't know whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not. The only thing we know that the Russians were using a very huge convoy of vehicles that were moving through the settlement of Vozdvizhenka in the northern or in the northeastern direction. Maybe during the next several days we're going to receive additional updates which will allow us to understand whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not. But one thing we know for sure, the Russians were attacking. Now we're just waiting for details. Now we are moving to the most important direction, to the Toretsk direction, where we got lots of very interesting updates. As for the city of Toretsk, we haven't received anything from the northern part. I'll remind you that during the previous 5 days we've been receiving lots of updates from the Ukrainian side of how they were attacking and counter-attacking the Russians around the mines of the city of Toretsk, and most likely during those attacks the Ukrainians managed to take under control several parts of the city, but as for now we see complete absence of anything. And there is another important thing, that this time, as for the 31st of January, the main activity of the armed forces of Russian Federation were taken in the southern and the southwestern part of the city of Toretsk. And according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. This is the map by the end of the 30th of January, and this is the map by the end of the 31st of January. As you can see, several territories were captured by the Russians and confirmed. Several territories were captured, but just according to reliable sources. Let's begin from the Sherbenovka, from the settlement of Sherbinovka. In this video that was published by the Ukrainian site, we can see the attack of Ukraine FPV drone, and this is it. That's it, nothing more. The Russian vehicle was destroyed exactly in this point, and you know that most of the mappers have adjusted the map as if the Russians were attacking from the city of Toretsk in the western direction, right exactly as you can see in front of your screens. But telling the truth, who knows, maybe the Russians were attacking from the settlement of Sherbinovka, so maybe it's not so easy to attack this way, so that's why most of the mappers colored their maps in Russian favor based on more easier way of attack. But telling the truth, I'm not even sure how exactly the Russians were attacking. As for now, we will keep the map as is, because I believe that during the next several days this entire pocket will collapse and the Russians will take everything from here under complete control. Furthermore, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to secure at least 50% of the pocket between the settlement, between Zabalka district and Nilipovka, which means that most likely when the Ukrainians began retreat process in the northern directions towards the settlement of Sherbinovka. So this is the reason, another reason why we adjusted the map like this, because we believe that during the next several days everything inside of this red line will be captured by the Russians, and then this is going to be just, it doesn't matter. Furthermore, currently the Ukrainians' main stronghold in this area, it's not even like a stronghold, something like a bastion or some temporary deployment point that Ukrainians use to control the situation in the Toretsk direction, is this mine. And the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory first with FABs and most likely with multiple launch rocket systems, and this situation indicates that this might be the next target for the Russian armed forces, and most likely during the next 5-7 days we're going to receive, or we're going to see first attempts from the Russian side to attack this industrial zone, to attack these facilities from the northwestern part of the city of Toretsk. If the Russians are able to take this stronghold under complete control, then as you can see the Russians will be able to shorten the distance to the Konstantinovka from the south as much as possible. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Chavar. There are very heavy clashes in this area. The Russians most likely managed to stabilize the situation in the northwestern part. This information was provided us by different mappers, and now the Russians turn their focus, turn their attention in the southeastern direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Shevchenko micro district. In this video we can see a Russian soldier that was moving through the fields and trying to secure the territory. Based on this video and based on several more episodes from the same video, we have adjusted the map in this part of the city of Chavar. The dynamic in this area, let's say this the Russian offensive in this area is intensifying. For example, this is the situation and this is the map by the end of the 28th of January. The Russians were very far from the southern micro districts of the city of Chavar. On the 29th of January the Russians secured some elevation in the vicinity of Zemlyanki micro district, and by the end of the 31st of January the Russians took under control another part of the southern Chavar. So we see that the news around the settlement is tightening. Obviously there are still a lot of job to do, but something tells me that soon the settlement of Chavar will fall in Russian hands, and then we are going to see the battle for Konstantinovka. But once again, to begin, let's say, full-scale offensive in the direction of Konstantinovka, the Russians need to improve their positions along the N32 road. Yes, the Russians did several attempts, and we discussed the situation 5 minutes ago, but we see that those attempts most likely didn't bring the Russians, let's say, required success, required results. Now let's move further. As for the Sievert's direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything. The southern Kupiansk direction or the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published lots of videos of how they were attacking Ukrainian forces and units in the forest and among this complex network of the fortifications, but without any changes on the ground. Now let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction, and according to geolocations, most likely we got the most important updates. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly on the Ukrainian side of the river Voskol. And now we can say that the sizes of this bridgehead is becoming very big, and most likely the Russians are about to collect the critical mass in this area, and most likely during the next 2 weeks the Russians will continue, of course, improving their positions here, but most likely we should expect that during the next 2-3 weeks the Russians will begin another full-scale offensive operation with the purpose to break through Ukraine defense belt, basically to defeat the Ukrainians in the Kharkiv direction and to encircle the city of Kupiansk, and maybe to restore control over the territories the Russians lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2022. So based on the video that we have just discussed, we have colored one part of these positions, and later we got another video from the settlement of Novomlinsk. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians were following and filming the Russian positions in this part, and then the Ukrainians attack the edge positions of the armored force of Russian Federation with FPV drone. So based on this video we have adjusted another part of the show of the river Voskol. So if we calculate the distance between the northern part of this bridgehead and the southern part of this bridgehead is already around 16 kilometers, and obviously this is a very big bridgehead. The Russians can use it now to do everything they want. Furthermore, the Ukrainians, as you can see according to this map, don't have lots of big or strong positions, fortified areas between the border and between the city of Kupiansk. The Russians have no barriers and no problems to attack between these two defense lines. This is the first defense line that goes from the city of Volchansk in the direction of the river Voskol, and this is another defense line that goes from the river or from the Pechenegi reservoir to the river Voskol itself. Now the Russians can advance between these two lines, and the Ukrainians will not be able to do anything with this. And if the Ukrainians want to stop the Russians, they will be forced to bring a lot of forces. So most likely during the next weeks or during the next months, the Ukrainians will give an order to fall back from this defense line in the direction of the southern defense line, because the Ukrainians can be encircled without any problems. The Russians are moving very fast when there are, let's say, strongholds in the fortifications, but when there are no strongholds in the fortifications, the Russians most likely will move much faster. Now let's discuss the situation in the Suja direction. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of important updates. The most important are coming from the settlement of Sverdlikova. The Ukrainians continue attempts to counterattack the Russian forces and to slow down the Russians and not to allow the Russians to take under control the settlement of Sverdlikova. But we see that the initiative is completely in the Russian hands. We got during the day probably tens or dozens of reports from different independent and reliable sources that there are very heavy clashes around the settlement of Sverdlikova, which means that there are just several days, and we can counting days before we receive first video from the settlement itself. Very interesting details and updates are coming from the southern part of Suja. Several pro-Russian, very reliable sources reported once again that the settlement of Makhnovka was captured today by the Russians, completely captured and secured. Furthermore, the same sources reported that the Russians didn't stop on, let's say, Makhnovka lines. The Russians continue advancing further in the northern direction, and several sources reported that currently the first Russian groups are entering the settlement of Zamosti, and that there are very heavy clashes already on the territory of this small village, which is already a part of the Suja agglomeration. If this information is correct, and if we receive updates about this Russian attack, then this is going to be complete disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the Suja agglomeration, because if the Russians are able to dig in deeper and to break through the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, most likely this will lead to the creation of several cauldrons. You know that these days we start receiving lots of updates from the Russian side about different criminals of the armed forces of Ukraine, and about different things they were making with the civilians in this area. We talked about this several months ago, and one of the main problems of Zelensky in the Suja direction is not like to hold these lines and not to allow the Russians to enter the territory of Sumy. The biggest problem for Ukraine right now is the civilians, and what kind of things Ukrainian soldiers did with the civilians of this area. I'm sure that we are going to see maybe not thousands but hundreds of cases of bad things that Ukrainians did with the Russians civilians in this area. We start receiving already, I believe you have already seen different articles and different videos published by the Russians about criminals, that's about criminal things that Ukrainians did in the settlement of Ruskaya Porechna, and this is just the beginning. The deeper the Russians and the closer the Russians are getting to the border, more and more criminals and bad things we're going to see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.